All right, so here we are, time period 4. We're finally going to connect the hemispheres in time period 4. As you can see, I've titled this one Global Interactions. This is sometimes referred to by historians as the early modern era, or the age of exploration, if you're looking at it from especially a Eurocentric view. 1450 to 1750 is our time period. So we're starting to get into shorter time periods now. Our last time period was 600 to 1450. So we're talking about a little over 800 years, and now 1450 to 1750, this is only 300 years. And our next time period will be 150, and then our next 117, I guess. So shorter time periods, which means more detail as we get into this. But I think you'll see that a lot of this stuff you probably already know, because this is where a lot of world history classes start for a variety of reasons. But so what have we done so far? So we started with time period 1, roughly 8000 BCE, maybe a little further back with the Neolithic Revolution, foundations of history. Humans are moving out of Africa, they're starting to form societies, they're starting to farm, they're starting to build civilizations as well. Time period 2 is our classical era, where we see the development of some major world religions, world empires, and the beginning of interregional trade. And we just moved out of time period 3, post-classical history, collapse of these classical empires, the emergence of Islam, and the spread of Muslims around Afro-Eurasia, the expansion of trade networks, migrations. So that brings us to 1450. Roughly speaking. So what are our big picture themes in time period 4 here? First, transatlantic connections. This is really the first time when we can talk about world history or global history, because this is the first time that both of the hemispheres are going to be interacting with each other. Those interactions are going to typically favor heavily the Eastern Hemisphere, the old world, but we'll see that both hemispheres will gain things and will lose things because of this interaction. So not surprisingly, because of the connection of the hemispheres, we see a vast expansion of interregional exchange and global trade, really. And this is referred to as the Columbian Exchange because it's initiated by the voyages of Christopher Columbus in the late 15th century. And the Columbian Exchange we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's the exchange of everything between the hemispheres. So think like food products, think manufactured goods, think ideas, religions, diseases. That's all in the Columbian Exchange. Second big picture theme is the development of new labor systems, especially coerced labor. Unlike in time period 3, where we see the actual creation of new labor systems like feudalism, we don't really see the creation of new labor systems so much as we see their expansion. The transatlantic slave trade is the most notable example and the most heinous example, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. The importance of coerced labor and slavery on different societies and throughout the world is certainly going to characterize time period 4. We also see the creation of maritime and land-based empires during this time period. In the past, empires had typically been contiguous. They hadn't really, how should I say it? Other than the Roman Empire, empires tended to expand over land, and the land that they controlled tended to be connected. This is going to start to change during the time period, and I think you'll see this when we get into especially the Portuguese Empire, which is a classic example of a maritime empire. But also think about the Spanish Empire, the English. The Great Britain is 4,000 miles away from its colonies in North America, where we currently live. This is something new. The land-based empires is not really something new, but their use of gunpowder in order to expand and to cement their control is the big difference there. And also, this is when Europe really begins to rise to dominance over the world system. And that is going to accelerate in time period 5, but these are the roots in time period 4. All right, so key concept 4.1 is the longest of the 3 key concepts. There are actually 7 concepts that are in Key Concept 4.1, because this is so important. It's the connecting of the hemispheres and all that comes with that. And so we're going to spend a lot of time here in Key Concept 4.1. 4.2 and 4.3 really flow from 4.1. So shorter notes and less class time that we'll spend on Key Concepts 4.2 and 4.3. So right off the bat, globalizing networks of communication and exchange. We actually start here in China with the voyages of Zheng He, who is the last great Chinese explorer. You can see on the map over there on the right. These voyages are really taking place in the early 15th century. He goes on a series of voyages, I think 7 if I remember correctly. And you can see that he actually makes it all the way over to the eastern coast of Africa and up into the Red Sea on one of his voyages. This is a time when China is pushing outwards and is looking to expand. And it's quite possible that Zheng He could have been the first to discover the Americas. What happens after his voyages, however, is that the Ming Empire has a change of heart, if you will, and they decide that journeying outward is not what's best. There are some in the Ming Empire who feel that Zheng He's voyages, while good on the one hand because he's interacting with new cultures and new peoples and he's creating new trade networks perhaps, this could also lead to destabilization because it could lead to new ideas, and new ideas can lead to challenges to old ideas. And if you're a Ming official, you don't really want old ideas challenged. And so the Ming Dynasty's response to his voyages is actually to try to erase them from history. They burn his fleet, they destroy as many records of the voyages as possible. And this is the last time that China is really going to push outward. They're going to turn inward and try to insulate themselves from the rest of the world until Europe really pries them open through trade. At the same time that China is receding inward throughout this time period, Europe is doing the opposite, and Europe is pushing outward. They are first exploring in the early 1400s, I should say mid-1400s, the Portuguese begin to push out into the Atlantic Ocean and down the African coast. And out of that is going to come eventual colonization of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and really all over the world. Although this colonization is not going to be complete, it's going to mostly hug the coastline, which we'll see as we get further into the notes. It's still going to be worldwide. And so we see two very different responses to things like improved technology. Whereas China is, to some extent, afraid of this technology, Europe embraces this technology. Many of these advances in technology that are discussed in time period 4 are coming from Asia. So they are first developed in Asia, and they are being utilized, improved by Europeans. So the astrolabe is an example of this. You can see a drawing of how the astrolabe works. It uses markers in the sky, things like the sun, or at night, stars, celestial objects, in order to make measurements and calculations based on the angle to the horizon of where you are. The magnetic compass is one that we're a little bit more familiar with. Couple this with improved cartography methods, so better map-making abilities, and new ship designs, larger ships that could carry more and travel further, like the caravel here. And you have this situation, if we take all 4 of these improvements in technology, as well as the others that come during this time period, and we've now created a situation where the exploration of very large bodies of water, Atlantic, Pacific Oceans, is now possible, whereas it wasn't before. So the significance here is that it allowed for Europe to expand further into the oceans. So the advances in technology is really, really significant here, because it's not that prior to the 15th century Europeans or anyone around the world didn't want to expand. It's that the technology was very limiting. It limited them to regional expansion and regional exploration. Now it becomes more possible to connect regions and even to connect the hemispheres. And so what we see is remarkable new transoceanic exploration. And so why? Well, we just talked about technology. So technology allows this to happen. We can consider technology a push factor. So it's pushing Europeans out into the oceans. There's also some other factors, however. The need to expand trade routes is one. The Muslim world is starting to push into Europe. Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, which is bad news for Christian and European traders. This is really scary to Europeans because they see the Ottoman Empire as ascendant. They see the Ottoman Empire as the powerhouse in that region of the world, and the Ottoman Empire is going to continue to expand into Europe for the next 200 years. Europeans don't want to trade through the Ottoman Empire anymore. It's becoming more problematic for them because the Ottomans are so powerful that they can dictate trade. And so the Europeans really see themselves as embattled against a rising Muslim world. And so what do? Rather than turn their attentions east, they turn their attentions west, and they think, how can we go around the Ottomans? How can we cut them out of trade? And the answer is by exploring the oceans and going around the tip of Africa, which we'll talk about in a moment. Second, religious motivations. There's the Protestant Reformation, which occurs in 1517. It's kicked off by a Catholic priest named Martin Luther, who issues a series of challenges to the Catholic Church in his very, very famous 95 Theses, in which he says the Catholic Church has a number of corrupt practices that need to be reformed. The Catholic Church rejected this and said, no, we're good. And a lot of people took up Martin Luther's cause and said, well, if the Catholic Church isn't going to reform, then we are going to create our own branches of Christianity in protest, hence Protestant, in protest to the Catholic Church's refusal to reform. So you get the Protestant Reformation. This is where we get Lutheranism and Calvinism and Methodist religions and pretty much every branch of Christianity that you can think of other than Catholic or Orthodox is a Protestant religion. The significance here is that now all of a sudden there is not one unified European Christian world. It is split. And so spreading the religion becomes all the more important. Catholic rulers want to expand Catholicism. The same for Protestant rulers, although it's mostly going to be Catholic rulers who are in control of the maritime European states. But the expansion of Christianity now takes on a new urgency during this time period. So the first two countries to really set out into the oceans in the late 1400s, early 1500s, I should say the Atlantic Ocean, not oceans, are Portugal and Spain. So why Portugal and Spain? Both are located adjacent to the Atlantic Ocean. Both have an issue with Mediterranean trade, that being Italy controls it, and so they want to cut out Italy, and they want to find their own trade routes. And so Portugal heads south. One of the most important figures in European expansion is undoubtedly Prince Henry the Navigator, who opens a school to teach maritime skills in the early 1400s. And, there he is. Hello. And this is going to lead to a series of Portuguese explorers. Portugal is just really going to invest heavily in exploration. And it leads to a series of Portuguese explorers who are going to make some really significant finds. Bartholomew Dias is one of these. In 1488, he sails around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the tip of Africa. So he's the first European to make it all the way down the west coast of Africa and sail around the tip of Africa. 10 years later, 1498, Vasco da Gama one-ups him and makes it all the way to India. He's the first European to do this. He's not the first European to be in India. He's the first European to set sail from Europe and make it all the way to India by ocean in 1498. Along the way, what begins happening is that the Portuguese start to create a maritime empire as they're setting up these trading posts, or what are at the time called factories, in Western and Eastern Africa, in places like the Congo, Angola, the Swahili city-states. These are all places that are challenged by and ultimately fall to European authority, as I should say Portuguese authority, as the Portuguese begin to expand around Africa. Spain takes a different tactic. Whereas Portugal is heading south and east over to India, Spain is heading west. The belief at the time is that the Earth is much smaller than we know it to be, and that setting out west into the Atlantic Ocean will ultimately bring you to Asia and to the Indies. And so in 1492, You all know what happens. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish rulers, fund Christopher Columbus, who himself is an Italian. Columbus makes it all the way to the Caribbean. He thinks it's India, and this is why Native Americans are referred to as Indians. And interesting fact about Christopher Columbus, he dies believing that he made it to India. It is not until after his death that people begin to figure out that, oh wait, this is something else. This is a different landmass with a different group of people. So there he is. Hello, Christopher Columbus. And so this leads to the European discovery of the New World and what they had really been looking for, although they didn't know it, which was gold. They believed they had been looking for new trade routes, but when they figured out that they had in fact stumbled upon new peoples and new land masses that had been previously unknown to them, they found that these people had something even more precious than spices or silks, and that was gold and silver as well. And so this leads to the Columbian Exchange and ultimately the colonization of the Americas by the Portuguese and the Spanish first, and ultimately the British, the French, and the Dutch as well. This happens very quickly. The Aztec Empire is conquered 1519, 1520 by Hernan Cortez, Spanish explorer, and the Inca by Francisco Pizarro in 1532. These are the two largest native empires at the time, and they are quickly conquered by the Spanish due to a variety of factors, which we'll take a look at in class, but disease is probably the most important one. Also, the Spanish have better weaponry and better military organization at the time, but disease is really the big one. So here we go. This is a great place to pause it if you'd like, kind of take in this map. You can see some of the European exploration and land claims that's going on during this time period. You can see 1488 is that Bartholomew Diaz voyage, which we can see here, leaving. Here's Portugal right here in case you need a little bit of a frame of reference, and then Spain is the purple right around that. And so Diaz, this dashed line here going down the western coast of Africa and sailing around the tip and then quickly turning around and heading back. This is about a 2-year voyage. This is not a quick thing that he goes on, and you can see Vasco da Gama is a 3-year voyage all the way to India and back. Ferdinand Magellan is the first European voyage that circumnavigates the globe. Magellan actually dies during this voyage in 1521, but some of his crew do manage to make it all the way around the Earth, and so this is why, even though Magellan dies in the middle of it, he gets credit for the first circumnavigation of the globe. So yeah, you can look at the rest of it. I won't point too much else out, but you can see here our big four in terms of colonization are going to be Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain, with the Dutch also playing a minor role in the Americas. And so this, of course, leads to the global circulation of goods. The significance of American gold, and especially silver, cannot be understated. Cannot be overstated, I should say. It can be understated because it's incredibly important. These are precious metals that every society around the world covets, and the Europeans find huge amounts of them in the Americas, especially silver, and this becomes the dominant form of exchange for Asian goods around the world. This leads to a global system of trade that is built primarily on American silver as the method of exchange. This allows the Europeans to really be the most powerful traders, because they're the ones who are mining the silver in the Americas, and they're then shipping this silver to their merchants who are using it to trade for Asian goods. So this puts Asian countries, Asian merchants at a significant and distinct disadvantage because they're reliant on this European gold and silver. Joint stock companies are also formed by Europeans during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The British East India Company is probably the one that you know. This is the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party, the connection here is that these are East India Trading Company ships that the colonists are throwing the tea into the harbor from. East India Trading Company lasts for over 200 years. Joint stock companies are companies that are low risk, to investors, it's very similar to our modern corporation. It's a pre-runner to the modern corporation, where instead of one person fronting a huge amount of money to start a business, a bunch of investors come together and they all invest a small amount of money, hence the joint stock portion of the company. The joint stock companies are going to be used by European states and European merchants to trade, but also to colonize much of the world. Mercantilism is the main economic system in time period 4. Capitalism doesn't really exist yet. Mercantilism is the forerunner to capitalism. And the idea of mercantilism is that a country wants a positive flow of wealth into their country. Mercantilism is viewed as a zero-sum game with other countries, which means if another country is getting richer, you inherently are getting poorer. Mercantilism is going to fuel a lot of competition amongst Europeans during this time period because of that belief. Mercantilism is also heavily state-sponsored. So unlike capitalism, which is, at least in theory, free market, people are free to do what they want with their money and with their investments, and companies should be free of government restraint. That's the idea of capitalism. Mercantilism is very heavy-handed in terms of government control. So that's a big difference between mercantilism and capitalism. Capitalism also isn't a zero-sum game. And so, I mean, the most important thing that we can talk about here in terms of trade is what's referred to as the Columbian Exchange. I put the definition up there from everybody's favorite resource, Wikipedia. The widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, disease, and ideas between the Americas, that's a typo, it should be, and Afro-Eurasia in the 15th and 16th centuries. Another great place to pause it, you can kind of take in all the different things that are being traded between the hemispheres. These are things that had never gone between the hemispheres. So things that we very much take for granted, like coffee, bananas, grapes, sugar, honeybees, earthworms, which isn't on here, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, these are all a part of our daily lives over here in North America. These all come from Afro-Eurasia. They had never existed in the Americas prior to the Columbian Exchange. And the reverse is true for a lot of things as well. Can you imagine Italy without tomatoes? Well, prior to 1492, they didn't have any. Can you imagine Ireland without potatoes? Same thing. These are all from the New World. These are all from our hemisphere, and they are traveling over to Europe. The big one here is, of course, disease. The number of diseases that are flowing from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas far outweighs the number of diseases flowing the opposite direction. This map doesn't have the only disease that flows this way, which is syphilis. Smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, these are really nasty, deadly diseases, especially for the people of the Americas who have never encountered them and therefore have no immunity to them. Populations in Afro-Eurasia have spent thousands of years developing immunities to these diseases. People in the Americas have not had that time, and when these diseases are introduced, especially smallpox, they devastate the populations. Some estimates say as high as 90 to 95% of the Native American population is destroyed by disease by the time we get to 1700. So in about 200 years, these diseases are going to lower the Amerindian populations by about 90 to 95%. So, what are our social changes? Well, we see a lot of religious changes, primarily interactions between religions and the spread and reform of existing religions. Christianity is being spread throughout Asia and the Americas by Christian missionaries who are almost always accompanying these explorers and merchants on their trips. So when Columbus and Cortez and Pizarro are going to the Americas, you better believe they also had priests on board who are attempting to convert the natives. Turning our attention to the Middle East, there's political rivalry between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, which is like modern-day Iran and Persia. And this intensified the split between the Sunni and the Shia, the two different branches of Islam. We'll talk a little bit about that in class as well. We also see the creation of syncretic religions, new religions, which are blending different parts of different religions to create distinct new religions. So voodoo, Vodun, in the Caribbean is an example of this, which is blending Christian practices with traditional African practices. This is a religion that still exists in the Caribbean today. Sikhism is another one that we are going to take a look at in class. There are some people who say that Sikhism is a distinct religion, but there are a lot of other people who say that Sikhism is actually a syncretic religion, which is blending elements of Hinduism and Islam together. So we'll take a look at that. That's why I have that question mark, because there's kind of a debate over this. Is Sikhism a distinct religion, or is Sikhism a syncretic religion, one that is blending different cultural practices and beliefs? So as merchants became wealthier, cultural changes ensued. Funding for the arts increased. This is the time of the European Renaissance. It starts a little bit earlier than our time period, mid-1300s we can say, for humanism and the interest in humanism. And it's going to go into the 17th century. Again, these are not hard and fast dates. The European Renaissance is a cultural movement that lasts for hundreds of years, so it doesn't really have a firm beginning and firm end date. And with the European Renaissance, this is why I chose this painting. Not only do we have an interest in the arts, but we also have increased literacy rates, and we have an increased focus on scientific inquiry and rediscovering the, air quotes around it, classics of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, especially Greece with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all that sort of stuff. The scientific revolution is also happening during this time period. 1543, which is when Nicholas Copernicus publishes his On the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, in which he claims that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Shocking. And of course he was correct. And a good end date for us is 1687, when Isaac Newton publishes his Principles of Mathematics. I think that's the name of it. He creates basically modern physics. Poof. In 1687, so the scientific revolution. All these things relate to the wealth of Europe that is happening during this time period, because as people get more and more wealthy, they can afford to spend their money on luxuries. And so all of these things, art, books, having the time to just like think about the way the world works, these are all luxuries of the upper classes. Whew, so we made it. Key Concept 4.1. Like I said, I promise Key Concepts 4.2 and 4.3 are going to be significantly shorter than Key Concept 4.1, which has so much of the foundational stuff for this time period. So you can go ahead and pause it if you're just working on Key Concept 4.1 and come on back to 4.2 when you are ready. And you're back. Key Concept 4.2, societal changes. So what's going on during this time period in terms of social structure, gender structure, racial, class, all that sort of stuff. The AP World Curriculum makes mention of the Little Ice Age, and it does very little else than that. And so it's probably just important for you to know that the Little Ice Age is something that's happening. It led to changes in agricultural practices. It also led to some demographic decline in the northern hemispheres. The Little Ice Age could also be viewed as a push factor for exploration. Farming is not as it's not as successful, it's not as easy for people in the northern latitudes, and so they need to find new ways to survive. And so they're going to leave their homes, they're going to explore new places. Think like, Vikings looking for new fishing grounds and stuff like that. So this is going to lead to changes in agricultural practices. It's also going to be a factor for the development of industry and industrialization, but we'll take a look at that in the next time period. So more specifically, changes in agricultural practices. We do see some new forms of social organization and modes of production, but really nothing that's too major. I'll come back to that in a moment. The expanded trade and the Columbian Exchange did, however, lead to huge changes. Social classes are beginning to change. Why, you say? Because merchants are becoming very, very wealthy. And with wealth almost always comes status and political and societal power. And that's absolutely happening in Europe during this time period. The merchants are going to be viewed as, to some extent, self-made men, and they're going to become really, really powerful, and that's going to lead to some readjustments of social classes. This is going to be the end of feudalism, for example. If you're taking a look at how social classes are changing, this is the beginning of the end of feudalism. It's going to last into places like Russia until like the early 20th century, but in places like Western Europe, feudalism is going to end during our time period. The significance of race, as a social construct is also characteristic of this time period. We can think of this in the Americas. Race is a really important and pervasive social construct for us. We can take a look at it in South America with the social structure that is developed in South America. This is a fairly complex social structure that we see here with Native Americans and Africans on the bottom. The mixed races, the mulattoes and the mestizos, who are partially European, partially Native or African, and then the Creoles, who are 100% European descent but born in America, and at the top, the Peninsulares, who are Europeans born in Europe, the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula here, because this is primarily a Spanish social structure because it's in South America. This social structure still exists in South America today. There are echoes of this social structure, just like there are echoes of our slave-based social structure in the Americas that we are still continuing to fight against. This social structure still exists in South America too. We already talked about the expansion of coerced labor. This is an important term for you to know, chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the form of slavery that exists in North America and the Caribbean, also South America, I should say. Chattel slavery is where slaves are viewed as property. They are not viewed as people. Historically, slavery had existed in human societies, but slaves had been viewed as people, and they had varying degrees of rights. Slaves could buy their freedom. Slaves had it depended on the society. But what we're seeing during this time period is the development of the most disgusting form of slavery the world has ever known, which is the slavery that dehumanizes Africans and views them not as people. It strips them of their identity and views them as property, as commodities to be bought and sold and to be controlled by whites. The encomienda system is the labor system that exists in South America. This is a little bit different than the plantation system that we're going to see in the Caribbean and North America. But the key to the encomienda system is, again, the fact that the natives and the Africans who are working in the encomienda system are going to be controlled, really to an extent that had not been seen before in world history. We also see in places like Asia, in China, the intensification of peasant labor, frontier settlements in Russia, cotton production in India are other good examples of this. So these are our changes in agricultural practices that we're seeing. There's a whole heck of a lot in here, and we will take some time in class to study it, but suffice it to say, just knowing that these things are happening is a good start. So, Roman numeral 3, as social and political elites changed, they also restructured ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies. So we can take a look at Japan for this. The existing elites were the daimyo, which are the Japanese equivalent to European nobility, and they enjoyed great freedom under the Tokugawa period, which is 1603 to 1868. So we're treading a little into time period 5 here. But what's starting to happen is that the Tokugawa shogunate are beginning to rein in the daimyo, and so we're seeing these nobles, these daimyo, who are being controlled by the shogunate, the shoguns, in places like Edo, where the daimyo are being forced to move, which is the historic capital of Japan. They had to live there every other year. They also had laws restricting dress, behavior, marriage, weaponry, and they are forced to contribute to public works projects. So we have this old feudal system that existed in Japan that's being flipped to some extent, and it's really going to change in the next time period when we get to the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Another great example of this is Louis XIV in France, who is curtailing the power. He is chipping away at the power of the nobility through the second half of the 17th century. And he's going to do this by kind of the same stuff. He's going to force the nobles to live in his palace, with him from time to time, and he's going to pass new laws which restricts the power the nobles have. This is, I talked about this earlier in Key Concept 4.1, but what we're seeing here is the end of feudalism, and this is the restructuring of these different ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies. We also see new elites if we're talking about new ethnic hierarchies. So the Manchu people in China, they conquer the Ming Dynasty, they sweep down from Manchuria, and they conquer the Ming Dynasty between 1644 and 1673, and they're going to create their own dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, which you can see is going to last all the way until the 20th century, 1911. So this is going to be a dynasty that is ruled by people who are not ethnically Han Chinese, who are Manchus. So they took over the government. They are an ethnic minority, but they adopted some old, ancient Chinese social customs and traditions, like Confucianism. They kept China Confucian because they realized making too many changes can really make people angry, and that could lead to revolt. And they also adopted the mandate of heaven, the idea that they are imbued by God to rule, that their authority comes from the heavens, so the mandate of heaven. And so this is the Qing Dynasty is a great example of these ethnic hierarchies and how they're being restructured during our time period. Sticking with the same concept here, Roman numeral 3. So changes in gender and family structures. Demographic changes in Africa is the best example of this, because what happens is, because of the slave trade, as it accelerates during the 1500s and 1600s and into the 1700s, men are being taken from Africa, and they are being prioritized because the men are more desirable as laborers. And what happens then is a massive imbalance of women to men in Africa, which is going to lead to really lasting demographic changes and demographic problems in Africa. Your curriculum also mentions a decrease in size of European families, although I'd like to note that this is mostly the next time period. This is mostly due to industrialization, but it is happening. It is starting to happen during this time period where European families are decreasing in size. So there you go. See, I promised it would be shorter. Key Concept 4.2, just a couple slides there, and only, I think we were under 10 minutes. And I think Key Concept 4.3 might be about the same. So you can pause it there, and I'll see you back here for Key Concept 4.3. And here you are again for the last of our key concepts in this time period, which is state consolidation and imperial expansion, Key Concept 4.3. Roman numeral 1. How are rulers legitimizing their power? There's a lot of continuity that we can find in this stuff. So religious doctrines, absolutism, circle that one, star that one, underline that one. Absolutism is a really important political doctrine that you should associate with time period 4, which is based on divine right. In Western Europe, France is the best example here. The rulers, the kings and queens of Western Europe, are going to wield absolute authority, hence absolutism, over their subjects. And how and why are they going to do this? What justifies it? Divine right, the right to rule granted by God. This should seem very similar to the mandate of heaven, which is how the Manchus over in China are legitimizing their rule. Another example of religious doctrines and how rulers cemented their powers, human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire, which is going to be really repulsive to the Europeans and is going to be, quote-unquote, evidence that these are uncivilized peoples. But, Europeans have their own uncivilized practices. But human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire is a good example of this. And Chinese emperors' public performance of Confucian rituals, we could also lump the mandate of heaven in here. And we talked about how the Chinese emperors, by the time we get halfway through this time period, are no longer Chinese. They are not ethnically Chinese. So what is going to help them legitimize their rule? Well, they are going to portray themselves as these devout Confucian followers. So, hey, I may not be Chinese, but I am put on the throne by God, and I am honoring God through these Confucian rituals. Another way which rulers are going to use to legitimize and consolidate their power is they build really cool stuff. Art and monumental architecture. The Palace of Versailles is a great example of this. It is still standing today. It's about 12 miles outside of Paris. If you ever go to Paris, you need to go to the Palace of Versailles, because no pictures will ever do it justice. The palace is built by Louis XIV, and it is expanded by Louis XV and Louis XVI. And the Palace of Versailles is this, it's actually a series of palaces over this huge sweeping grounds. And the Palace of Versailles is going to show French subjects, but also the rest of the world, how great the French king is, how great Louis XIV is, or Louis XV, or Louis XVI. And so this is going to help the Louis consolidate their power. The Taj Mahal in India is another great example of this, which is constructed, it's actually a mausoleum that is constructed for one of the Mughal emperor's wives when she dies. Taj Mahal is another one of those incredible relics that is still standing today in India, one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. The ability of the rulers to build these huge, intricate, impressive structures, it creates this sense of awe, and it creates this sense of reverence. Why is this person ruling? Because holy cow, they can do that. They are that incredible and that powerful. So, Roman numeral 2 here, imperial expansion relied on increased use of militaries and armed trade. So we're going to go through the different types of state consolidation and imperial expansion that we're seeing here. And I'm going to show you some maps to hopefully ram this home a little bit. So trading post empires are established by Europeans across Africa and Asia. And as the name suggests, these empires are not really large in terms of land area. They are dotted all around the world, and their purpose is trade. Their purpose is to facilitate trade and to make trade easier for Europeans across Africa. So we see this here, and Asia. So if we're looking at the map here, what we're seeing is Portugal is the green, right? And actually, oh, these are all Portuguese. Yeah, this entire map is Portuguese. So what we're seeing here is these brown dots are the trading posts, or the factories, as they would be called, and the green are larger swaths of land that are colonized by the Portuguese. So we do see that the Portuguese are colonizing parts of land. Brazil is the most famous example of this. They still speak Portuguese in Brazil today. But mostly the Portuguese are expanding through the setting up of these factories, these trading posts. And you can see how far they get and how quickly they get there. A lot of these factories are set up by the time we get to 1520 or so, and they've even made it all the way into Japan as well. I'm beginning to, I think these might be, are these Dutch? I don't know. I'm going to let you know, because the Dutch are the ones in Japan. I'll fix it in class. How's that? Lest you think I'm all-knowing. I am definitely not all-knowing. Second, land-based empires, which at this time period are going to be called gunpowder empires, because of their use of guns in order to expand. Gunpowder was, I don't know if it was invented or discovered, either way you want to look at it, in time period 3. But its use is really going to be expanded in time period 4. The Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire in India, the Qing Empire in China, the Ming before them. These are all good examples of gunpowder empires who are relying on the use of gunpowders, cannons, and armed trade. They're land-based empires. The gunpowder empires are land-based empires, so they are not in any meaningful way going out and exploring into the oceans. They are instead focusing on expansion over land. And so this is a beautiful map which is showing us the expansion of these gunpowder empires during our time period. Most impressive, perhaps, is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is this, like, I don't know what color this is. It's like a creamsicle color or something. I don't know, something like that. You're going to tell me I'm wrong, because I'm partially colorblind. But you can see here the Ottoman Empire includes this, which is their historic heartland. This is kind of where the Ottoman Empire starts here in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and they expand outward very rapidly. We talked about this in Key Concept 4.1. This is what's scaring the Europeans right here. This is why Europeans out on the fringes are going this way and this way, because this way doesn't look good anymore. Going overland through the Ottoman Empire, through the Safavid, through the Mughal Empire, this doesn't really look good anymore. So these are our gunpowder gunpowder empires. The maritime empires. So the maritime empires, you can contrast them with the trading post empires like the Portuguese and the Dutch. The maritime empires are still trading, still interested in setting up trading posts, but the maritime empires are really interested in colonization and large-scale colonization and mining for resources, things like that. So we can include the Portuguese and the Dutch in here as well, because as we saw in that map, the Portuguese and the Dutch are controlling some land areas, but the Spanish, the French, and the British are the big ones here when we're talking about maritime empires. And this map, despite the fact that the resolution kind of sucks, is a good example to show us this. The Spanish in the green here, the Portuguese in the brown here. Remember we talked about Brazil. The French, New France. The British North America, we're very well acquainted with. The Dutch don't really show up on the map here, but they have, New York, Dutch New York, and they also have the Dutch East Indies over here. And so it's not to say that trading post empires are not maritime empires. The Portuguese and the Dutch can be considered both, but it's really the British, the French, and the Spanish who are colonizers during this time period. So last, are there any challenges to expansion? Absolutely, there are challenges to expansion. We shouldn't view this time period as this constant outward flow of Europeans and this constant progress or progressive movement. We do not want to view history in that way. There are things that are slowing Europeans down, taking up their attention. The 30 Years' War is a good example of this, which is during the early 17th century. You can kind of view this as a first... now you don't want to view it as the First World War, but it's certainly like a massive, all-encompassing European affair, the 30 Years' War. Piracy, you can see our little pirate representative over here, and peasant uprisings are all things that are going to slow down European expansion. But that said, Europeans aren't really meeting a lot of organized resistance to their expansion, which is why this time period is often viewed as this consistent outward march of Europeans into the outer world. That's a little bit of a fallacy. We shouldn't really, or an illusion. We shouldn't really view it that way. It's an ebb and flow, but certainly, if we look at a map of the world in 1450 and we contrast it to a map of the world in 1750, things look a lot different. And one of the primary reasons is because Europeans are now everywhere. So that's it. Key concept 4.3. You're all done. It goes around 10 minutes. Not bad. Hope you learned something, and see you in class.